When we look back at timepieces through the years, there are a number of different lenses to peer through. Wristwatches, pocket watches, shelf clocks, tall case clocks, tower clocks. There is a storied history with each era of watchmaking, and one seldom told is that of the American watchmaking industry and its ultimate decline. The art of watch and clock making in America helped start the Industrial Revolution, setting standards for mass production and interchangeable parts that would ultimately be adopted by the Swiss watchmaking industry.
What changed here in Connecticut was the industrialization of the mass production of timepieces. And this is what really ties in with horological history today.
On this journey for Watches in the Wild, we're taking the road through America to discover the legacy that remains for American watchmaking.
We're on a mission. James and I are on a mission.
Okay.
We're driving all over doing this thing, and that is trying to get to the core of American watchmaking, where it's been, where it's going.
So I think watches and cars are really made for each other. You know, I think you go all the way back on motorsport stuff and how people were actually physically using watches, you know, in motorsport, but then I think just lifestyle-wise, it really fits.
It meshes.
They're made hand in hand.
I ordered it off of eBay, and when it arrived, it still had mud stuck between the lugs. So I'm sure somebody just grabbed it out of a drawer and just felt the watch had a life before it got to me.
That's great.
We'll travel through Boston and discover the history of Waltham and Bristol.
Democratizing the accessibility of a product. That was the distinguishing characteristic of the Waltham Watch Company.
We'll take a train to Lancaster, Pennsylvania for a look back at the start of Hamilton, and to look at a modern American watch company like RGM. We take a look behind the scenes with Josh Shapiro in Los Angeles, and take the Pacific Coast Highway to San Francisco to visit a very special collector of old Hamilton watches.
One of the fascinating things about Hamilton is they made everything.
Join us as we hit the road to discover the story of the American watchmaking industry on this season of Watches in the Wild.
Welcome to Watch City, and no, not Geneva, Switzerland. We're here in Waltham, Massachusetts, on the site of the old Waltham Watch Factory. In the late 1800s, the late 1950s, was the center of watches in Massachusetts and a big horological center in the United States. There was an industry here. This was a watch town, and most of the town worked in this factory. At its peak, we're talking a production of over 5,000 watches per day, all due to that American manufacturing sensibility. Now, the factory, the building itself is still here, but they no longer make watches. And it's not abandoned like some of the other factories that we've seen. Instead, like many buildings in this country, it's been converted into condos, lofts, businesses. And yet, there's still a museum inside dedicated to preserving that history. And today, we're gonna head inside and check it out. So let's go see what it's like in there.
There's a whole bunch of historical pieces in here that show change and innovation over the years. It's always fun to try to figure out what some of these machines are on my own, but I figured I could use the help of Bob Perry. He's the executive director of the museum.
What is this big honking piece of machinery that we're seeing right over here, Bob?
So this is a set of machines, and they are examples of the early machines that were designed and built by the mechanics and engineers at the Waltham Watch Company. They're examples of the first machine tools ever made to make watch parts. They are what transitioned the world from handmade watches to machine-made watches.
The American watch industry has a rich and fascinating history, beginning in the 19th century when American watchmakers revolutionized the industry with the introduction of machine-made watches. Companies like Waltham, Elgin, and Hamilton became household names, producing high-quality timepieces that were both accurate and affordable.
Watches were a luxury product for the rich. Why? Because everything was handmade. That is special now, but it is not conducive to democratizing the accessibility of a product. That was the distinguishing characteristic of the Waltham Watch Company.
However, the industry saw a decline in the mid-20th century due to competition from Swiss and Japanese manufacturers. Many American companies went out of business, leaving behind a legacy of innovation, but also a sense of loss.
These are patterns for watchbacks,
Right.
for pocket watchbacks
At large scale?
at large scale. And this blank area is where they would have inscribed the initials of the watch owner. What this lever and gearing mechanism did,
I see.
an artist would, on this Bakelite disc, carve a watchback pattern. And a technician would be trusting that the gravers at the end of each of these would be properly etching on the 28 watchbacks that would be placed on each of these discs. This was an early step in trying to introduce a little bit of mass production.
The idea of mass production was something that Aaron Dennison, the founder of Waltham Watch Company, focused on very heavily. To be able to scale up, innovative techniques and new inventions were made to pioneer the mass production of interchangeable watch parts. A couple hours down the road from Waltham is the hometown of the Ingram Clock Company, Bristol, Connecticut, which happens to be the hometown of John Reardon, a renowned expert on vintage watches and a board member of the American Clock and Watch Museum. Through his work, Reardon is helping to keep the legacy of American watchmaking alive and inspiring a new generation of watchmakers to continue pushing the boundaries of this timeless craft.
When we go back to the beginning, we were all in school taught that the cotton gin was made by Eli Whitney,
Sure.
and then that started the whole Industrial Revolution in the Americas. It's nonsense. It was really started by Eli Terry, just a few miles from here. And Eli Terry really started the Industrial Revolution in the Americas with clocks. What does that mean? It means interchangeable parts and manufacturing multiple pieces at the same time. And it really ignited this whole area of Connecticut. The watch story for Bristol in particular really didn't start until the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and it's about the Ingram watch. Ingram was one of the first companies that was able to create a watch that cost, get this, $1. So here we have some amazing examples of many of these we would call dollar watches, simply because they cost $1 originally. So we're talking early 20th century. This was like the breakaway price point, but one that really just
That's gorgeous.
jumped out is this Ingram Viceroy, and you'll see radium made in the USA. When I look at this watch, I think of things a little differently now.
Yeah.
Lives were lost as a result of these. Radium, of course, was great functionally, but at huge, huge costs. And here we have an example with original radium hands.
What would a watch like this have been? I see there's almost like, I guess it'd be the pocket watch equivalent of a double stamp, or at least a custom dial for a business or something to that effect.
Yeah, it's great because we love to find a Patek Philippe with the original Tiffany signature. But here we have an Ingram with the original Buster Brown signature.
There you go.
Companies would buy these in mass in order to put their own branding on them. And of course, made in the USA, right on the dial. When you wind them up, it's almost like it's like a crankshaft. I mean, it's a nice loud noise. This one's, let's see if it still has some life. Yeah, there we go. The Swiss companies were watching very closely in the late 19th century what the Americans were up to. Patek Philippe, which is my wheelhouse in particular, they were fascinated with what Waltham was doing and fascinated how the industrialization of using interchangeable parts could be used in their manufacturing. And in a way, that traditional watchmaking of Europe, we, as Americans, exported the idea of mass production to the Swiss. And here we are today, still talking about, is it in-house, or is it something that was, who are the suppliers, or is it an independent maker, or is it mass production? Those same questions and conversations were being held 100 years ago, 150 years ago. And it's just so fascinating to see where we're sitting now connects with horology in general.
So when was, do you know like approximately like what era this was built? Not like a year, but.
It's, in fact, I do know.
Okay.
1863.
Wow.
But it wasn't until 1907 that what you see here with all this extra warehouse space was built.
Wow.
And
so right at the beginning of the Civil War, they started construction.
So this session's name has always been very important in Bristol. And as you can see now, it's abandoned. There are a lot of broken glass and forgotten memories.
The Sessions Clock Company was one of the clockmakers in Connecticut in the early 1900s, along with Ingram, Ausonia, New Haven, and the Seth Thomas Clock Company. Bristol was a haven for industrial innovation, and it all started with clocks.
I spent my high school years learning this and spending time here in this museum, and all of these clocks I had the pleasure of winding weekly. And that really opened my eyes to being proud of being from Bristol, being proud to be part of Connecticut watch and clockmaking, and ultimately helped me understand the big picture of American industrialization. This one's dated 1926, I could see in the dial, the New Haven Clock and Watch Company, and it's called the Tip Top. And this is interesting because this is a transition piece from pocket watch to wristwatch, so you could really see how people are trying to define what a wristwatch should look like.
Yeah.
And I love this, the strap. I mean, it's a really interesting case study of an American take on how a wristwatch should look.
I mean, I have to wonder if some of where this has been missing from our own culture and consciousness is the fact that American watchmaking did sort of disappear.
Mass production, the concept worked all too well. And that mass production moved to other parts of the world. So these watches here in the area, they became obsolete and everything was outsourced. Factories closed one after another. Within 10 miles of where we're sitting, there were over 200 different watch and clock makers.
Wow.
And by the 1950s, I don't know the exact amount top of my head, but I would say there's less than a dozen. And then another 10, 15 years after that, there was no one.
There must have been a huge portion of the community that would work here.
Absolutely. In its heyday, hundreds of people would have worked in this factory. And literally, this is one of the main houses that built Bristol at the turn of the century, at the turn of the 20th century, was the palace of clockmaking in America.
And it's amazing that we can at least see one of these and understand and appreciate the scale. Nice. All right, now we're going to try to get inside. Should we peek through that door? Or does that seem like not a good idea?
That looks like it's actually something going on in there. Well, check out this window. That's cool. You can see wooden floors.
Is it locked?
Oh, well, we just set a light on.
Oh.
No way. After you. Can you smell that?
Yeah, oh yeah.
What a culture. Oh, wow. Oh, that's creepy.
Let's do it. Oh, wow. Well, who was in there? Like,
They were working. It was like a normal office. Do you think there's lead paint?
I wouldn't put it past the Bowery. Help me, I'm trapped inside the walls. That's what this says.
Yeah, I think it's time to get out. O'Brien Funeral Home. Construction of the main house began in 1890 with the east side facing East Main Street, designed to resemble a river showboat It really does.
Yeah?
You can see that on the Mississippi.
It feels a bit like we're eulogizing, you know, the watch industry here, but a lot like the way we collect objects. To be able to have them, like physical objects, physical locations that we can visit, they still hold the memories of what once was. I mean, what does that mean to you? You have your own personal connection to Bristol. Does it mean more to you? Do you find that's an important thing to have, to hold on to?
I never thought of it that way, but I like what you said. Like an auction catalog description is a eulogy to an object. In many cases, it's a way to inform and connect emotionally, so people will bid. But in the same way, museums do the same thing. It's a eulogy to, in this case, a past industry in Bristol. And part of me is quite happy to see buildings such as this, which were part of the horological history of Bristol, to survive. And I just hear so many people that are embracing their horological endeavors. And I hope they could look back at Bristol to maybe learn from the opportunities and mistakes of those before us.
Yeah.
I think we're the first person in here in a very long time. What we have here is the original certificate of origin for this extraordinary watch, dated 1889. And the reason it's so important to me, this is the first Patek Philippe I ever saw in my life as a teenager. And I would have never known that this little St. George Patek Philippe changed my path and my understanding of horology. Even the description of it was for the American market. It says open face silver case watch with a St. George coin. I find it very comforting and poetic that we found a Patek Philippe here in Bristol, Connecticut.
One of the outstanding features of this building is the windows, because in the earliest days they were working by natural light.
There's no artificial light.
That's right.
Right.
Eventually gas lights and then ultimately electric lights over time. They bridged those eras, but at the very beginning, no, they needed the sun.
I wanted to return over here to this smaller exhibit for the E. Howard Watch Company.
Howard worked for the Waltham Watch Company and then broke away and started his own company. The E. Howard Company made watches but also made clocks, and we've got a great example of one of their tower clocks. This was, I mean, if you're a Bostonian, you know the Schrafft's Candy Company. This was their tower clock, and Howard made this tower clock. This still works. One of our volunteers winds it every week. Why towers are so tall? Well, partly it's because you want your clock to be seen, but you also want to have a very long drop for the weight, because it's how long that drop is that determines how long the clock will run before you have to wind it up again.
It seems like everywhere we go on this trip uncovers new threads and new places, new avenues for us to travel down. And we're now in front of the old Howard Clock factory. And it's just amazing to see that these structures, I mean, this doesn't have the scale and the breadth and the size of a Waltham, but it's still here, it's still intact, and it's a living memento to what was once one of the great clockmakers in America that had its home right outside of Boston. Something like that.
Before anyone was walking around with the G-Shock on, people had to rely on other means to tell the time, like the town clock tower. Clock towers, or turret clocks, started appearing in the 1600s. And Boston has a few distinguishable towers still operating today. Luckily, I was able to find a local patron to show me around.
I think no trip to Boston is complete without a little stroll down the Freedom Trail. Your name, sir?
My name is Isaiah Thomas, publisher of the Massachusetts Spy newspaper.
That's wonderful, and you're going to be sort of taking us around the horological history of the city a little bit?
Sure.
What building, what structure is behind us here?
So this is the Old South Meeting House, yeah, basically back then when they said meeting house, they meant what we mean today when we say church, and when they said church, they meant what we mean when we say congregation. So basically, the church is the people, the meeting house is the building. This building was built in 1729, and it's where the meeting took place that led to the Boston Tea Party. So pretty historic, pretty important turning point in the Revolution.
And at that time, there was no clock on the building?
I doubt it, yeah.
Okay.
I wouldn't imagine there would have been a clock then.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay. I hesitate to ask this next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Ask it, please.
When did do you know when that clock ended up on that building?
I do not.
That's okay. We made the long trek across the street.
Yep.
And now behind us we have a skyscraper, it looks like.
That is our second skyscraper to be built in Boston. Again, it's not super tall by today's standards of skyscrapers, but for many years that was the tallest building in Boston. It was the most recognizable building in our skyline because there was a law that said no building in Boston could exceed a certain height. But eventually we figured out a way around the law by building this tower here, because where this tower stands today is on top of an already existing 3-story federal Customs House building, which meant technically this was not Boston land, but federal U.S. land. So it was the only place it was legal to build a tower. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's
I guess the sky is federal land too.
That's true. Yeah. I think that our government would claim to own the sky.
Yeah.
And yeah. Why not? We wanted to make sure that people could see the clock even at night. So at night, the numbers of the clock light up, so it can be seen from all around this area. The hands of the clock do not light up, so you can't tell what time it is. But you can tell it's a clock, and I think that's the important part.
I think you can. I can tell it's a clock from this distance for sure.
Sure. I've been looking to get a new watch.
Yeah? What kind of watch do you wear?
I haven't worn a watch in years, but I mean, definitely nothing that was worth any money. I had a Casio, I think.
Period accurate, for sure.
Clock towers weren't the only historic relics in Boston, however. Isaiah also took me to see a special clock inside an old church, or what they call a meeting house.
So here we are. And where are we?
This is Christ Church, more commonly referred to as the Old North Church.
Oh, wow.
And there's this clock right here dates back to 1726, I've been told.
That's a long time.
Yeah.
It's just amazing to think that a clock can have this long of a life and, you know, influence so many of the clocks that we know today.
Yeah.
This Christ Church, Old North Church as we all know it now, has been here since 1723. It's the oldest still standing church in Boston. It's an active Episcopal church. It is famous because this is the place where Paul Revere's lantern signals were held up in the highest point of our steeple.
And now behind us is sort of looming over the church is a pretty remarkable clock. What is the history of that clock? Is it as old as the church itself?
Well, the clock is actually from 1726. The clock, it's the Avery Bennett clock. The clock has kind of been running continuously up until around a year ago. You know, some of the mechanisms would have stopped and needed to be kind of restored and started again. But the clock is, you know, actively running. It's telling the time. Our sexton, who is actively working here and managing the property, she has to wind it pretty much weekly. Sometimes it falls a little behind, but this clock's been hanging, we had 296 years.
Wow.
And if you think about all the history here in Boston, colonial, revolutionary, Civil War, you think about the people who have passed through here, wealthy merchants, ministers, slaves, and indigenous folks, people sitting up in the galleries here, that clock has been ticking at the same time for generations.
That's
we
incredible.
Share the sounds of history, you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Julius really put in perspective how we are all connecting to these timepieces, whether we realize it or not. It may just be a clock, but it's something we all share, no matter who we are.
All right, Isaiah, my guide, blast from the past. This has been really a special experience to be able to explore the horological history of Boston with you. You know, I think the clock was super special.
Yeah.
I think we can both agree.
Clock. Yeah, absolutely.
You know?
Yes.
And as sort of as a token of my appreciation, I think it'd be cool to bring something from the future, you know, from a little place called Switzerland, where in a time far beyond yours, they're making little items called wristwatches. They're kind of like clocks.
Like clocks?
Just much smaller.
Okay.
And they can fit on your wrist.
Huh.
So I'd like you to have this.
Oh, thank you so much.
From me to you. You can actually track 2 time zones.
All right. Let's see if I can get this on here.
I bet you can do it.
It makes me feel more futuristic already just wearing it.
They say these are timeless, and you're really proving the point.
It's so true. I can play this. Wait, let's see if I can make this work.
Yeah. Superman, I love
Superman,
it.
Yeah.
Before I hit the road, I decided to stop by one last place I kept hearing about, called Colonial Trading. It's one of the few watch shops left in Boston, and it's run by someone they call the Watch Guy.
Do you get a lot of American pieces in here?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
Most of these are American pocket watches. There's Walthams, Elgins, Hamiltons.
Yeah, you have any interesting Walthams up there we can take a look at?
There's some railroad grades. Hamilton. Well, here's an interesting watch. It's not a Waltham, but it's a Ball Standard. It's a railroad grade.
Okay.
So it's going to be a lever set, 21 jewel with adjustments.
Oh, wow.
There it is. And it starts right up.
Railroad watches were some of the most accurate watches during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We'll cover more on that when we head to Lancaster.
Here's an older Waltham Hunter. Also lever set.
Yeah, we were talking to one of the curators of the museum over there about how the names sort of changed over the years, from the American Watch Company to American Waltham Company to Waltham Company. It's cool to see the American Waltham Watch Company on the dial.
Yep, that's in really nice condition.
How do you become known as the watch guy?
Because I'm here.
Yeah?
The watch hospital went out of business.
Uh-huh.
I'm the last guy left.
How did you get into this? Like, what's your first memory of a watch or a clock?
I was going by a house and they were doing a clean out, and sitting right on top of the garbage barrel was a Benrus tank. Had it cleaned up, wore it for years. A girlfriend wanted it. I said, take it. It's still running.
Do you take in any American wristwatches?
Mostly Art Deco or complicated watches.
Yeah?
I mean, it doesn't pay to fix a regular Waltham wristwatch from the 30s, especially with cleaning now.
Sure.
It's $150 to $200.
Just to clean it?
And a mainspring is $50.
Mm-hmm.
Just supposedly one factory making mainsprings now.
Are the parts for Waltham watches still out there for those that service them?
There's plenty of movements out there because people have scrapped out the cases. A lot of the gold is just getting melted, because like a heavy case like this probably has $1,500 in gold.
Sure.
If the watch is just time only, it's got limited value.
What is the price range for pocket watches that you sell, like for low end to high end?
They start at about $275 and go upwards.
There's some watches in that case too that we'd love to see as well. I think it's a Rolex date that you have in the other window.
Believe it or not, the movement's marked for 1938.
Okay.
And the case was done in '58.
Who recased it?
Rolex.
The watch guy got me wondering what might be on the wrist of a watch enthusiast out there in Boston. So I went online to ask some friends about their take on the American watch community here. And I was invited to a local gathering that just happened to be going on outside of Boston while I was in town.
Like the picture of him like on the baseball mound at Northwestern.
I know, and it was like 2 years ago.
Yeah,
you know?
The group is called Escapement, and it's amazing to see such a diverse group of people get together to share their love of watches.
Can we take it off the roll for a second?
Of course,
yeah.
dude. Like, all these, of course, man.
The one watch I'm asking to take off the roll, you know?
Dude, it's so good.
It
is. Literally. It's so good. This Grand Seiko is 40 millimeters, and I'm, wearing a 5164R travel time.
And it's sitting in a sea of Journe, AP, Patek.
The modern American watch industry is experiencing a resurgence these days, with a growing number of small, independent watchmakers producing unique and high-quality watches, like Josh Shapiro in Los Angeles.
David Chang, I want to thank you for inviting us into your home.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Switzerland is thousands of miles away in one direction, California thousands of miles away in the other direction, and you happen to be wearing a Shapiro watch. I'm curious to know what this watch represents to you. We spoke a little bit about it off camera. This is a pretty special piece.
My introduction to Josh was a few years ago through a local watch dealer, seeing that watch being introduced very tangentially that day to the watchmaker. I decided the next day I had to call him and reached out to him. I spent an hour with Josh on the phone, and he, it's like meeting a celebrity, but the fact that Josh was willing to spend that much time with me was very special. he made the watch for me almost in its entirety. He called me right before it was done and asked me if I would be in LA, in Los Angeles, anytime soon. And I have family out there, so looked for an excuse to fly out there, visited him at his manufacturer, and he brings me to one of the beautiful machines that he's adorned his manufacturer with, goes through the instructions and tells me, all right, it's time to finish your watch. So it was really an honor and something very special. I can't tell you, I was even more nervous than I probably am now to actually.
Well, you don't seem nervous now.
Oh, you're kind to say that. But to actually finish the watch in itself. It was really not just a love for the watch, but a love for the watchmaker and what he represents and what he's trying to do for the watchmaking industry in this country.
We were just looking at David, the host of this event, his Shapiro piece.
Oh, great.
And I wonder if you have thoughts on what it would mean to you to see that same craftsmanship spread not just from a watchmaker like Shapiro, but across America. If America could return to or become a place where there is a watchmaking culture, and what that would mean.
I think that would mean there's a shift in appreciation of old world craftsmanship.
Yep.
You know, you have to be patient to say, hey, this is something, you know, I will wait 9, 12, 18 months to get something that is truly handcrafted and handmade that really speaks to me. And I would love that, but I'm not sure if we're there yet.
It's tough to imagine the American watch industry returning to the giant it once was. The American ideal of mass production worked too well, and we ultimately couldn't keep up with the rest of the world. What's left is the history and the knowledge, that we started a revolution of industry that set the standard of watchmaking for years to come, and inspired a new generation of watchmakers to pick up the pieces.
I'd like to share with you from this poem from 1876 about the grandfather clock.
I'd love to hear it.
And this is just the first verse, but I think you'll get the gist of it. My grandfather's clock was too large for the shelf, so it stood 90 years on the floor. It was taller by half than the old man himself, though it weighed not a pennyweight more. It was bought on the morn of the day he was born, and was always his treasure and pride. But it stopped short, never to go again, when the old man died. Now, I remember my mother, she used to actually sing this song to me when I was a little kid. And these lyrics are, I think, exemplify the emotional connection people have with clocks within their homes. And certainly also resonates with all of us with our wristwatches today and the stories that we have and how they connect to our daily lives or celebrating an important event. And that same emotion and feeling that we feel for watches today certainly existed with clocks in the past. Not so bad for a 107-year-old.
On the next episode of Watches in the Wild, The Road Through America, we take an old train through Lancaster, Pennsylvania, head to the original factory of Hamilton watches, and we visit the manufacturer of one of America's greatest living watchmakers.